Hey everyone! In today's video, I want to talk about how you can grow melons in containers. This is my first year growing melons, so I'm not an expert, but they've been doing really well, so I want to go over what I've done and offer you some tips if you want to try growing melons in your container garden. First things first, I want to talk about the varieties I'm growing. So I'm growing 3 different varieties. I'm growing a watermelon called Mini Love, so the melons themselves stay a little bit smaller. I think that's good if you're growing in a container garden that you're looking for melons or overall plants that are going to remain a bit smaller. But I didn't do that with my Cantaloupe and Honeydew, which I'm growing. Those are the normal size melon plants. So the Mini Love watermelon is what you can see right here, and then I have a Cantaloupe that I think is called Sarah's Choice, and then a Honeydew that I believe is called Snowline or Snow Leopard. I'm excited for that one though, because I think it's going to be a white melon with green veining. I don't love Honeydew in particular, but I'm excited for what they're going to look like. I am also excited to see if they're going to taste different than what I'm used to just from store-bought Honeydew. But I absolutely love cantaloupe, I absolutely love watermelon, so I'm incredibly excited that I'm actually able to grow them in my container garden, because I think melons is one of the plants that I just thought might not work very well, and so far I have had really great success. I've actually already harvested 1 watermelon and eaten it, and it was delicious. Alright, so let's start talking about exactly how you can grow them in containers. Now, even though the plants can get quite large, they're still pretty easy to grow even in relatively small containers. I'll talk a little bit more about container size in general, but for the most part I'm either growing my melons in grow bags, which are 5 or 7 gallon, or in some of the raised beds that I have in my garden, and they seem equally happy in both places. Now, the plants are going to vine, so you are either going to need space for them to vine, or you're going to need some sort of trellis system. I have a combination of both with some of mine. I am allowing some just to completely sprawl out on the deck. Others I have on trellis systems, and I'll take you up close around the different melons and where they're growing in just a little bit later on in the video. So now I'm going to take you up close to the melon plants themselves. I'll show you where I'm growing them and the different types of containers and support systems that I'm currently using. So in this grow bag, you can already see there's a melon that's a pretty good size in there. This one might be ready to harvest in a couple weeks, but this is one of the watermelon plants. I think this is a 10-gallon grow bag, and actually the vines, so some are spilling down there. Some are coming up here, and this vine with this watermelon is actually the same exact plant. Most of these plants will put out 2 to 4 melons per plant. I think I have 8 plants total, so we should have a pretty good amount of melons. But in terms of containers, you can use really any material. It can be a grow bag, a raised bed, terracotta, plastic. And it doesn't have to be huge, but you want it to be obviously large enough to support the plant itself. So ideally you want to look for something that's about 16 inches deep, about 14 inches in diameter. And as long as you're pretty close to those measurements, you should have something that's capable of growing a melon plant. So the container doesn't have to be huge, but again, you want to make sure you have the space for the vines to trellis or to climb up something, depending on your garden space and what you want to do. So this is the watermelon plant. Over here, I have a honeydew plant. The watermelon has been a lot faster in terms of developing the actual fruit compared to the honeydew and the cantaloupe, but I am seeing flowers, and I'm seeing very, very tiny melons starting on some of them. But like I said, this is one of my honeydew melon plants right here. So this is actually planted in the raised bed, and I have it starting to grow up this support system right here. Coming over here then, now this raised bed actually has just 2 melon plants in it, and you can see how much room they're taking up. This is a cantaloupe plant on the left, and then the same honeydew plant over here on the right, and they're basically cascading down this bed. And I have actually been trimming off the ends just to make sure it doesn't get too wild and out of control. I don't 100% know if you're supposed to do that, but I have been doing it, and they're still starting to form melons, so at least keeping it in control that way with the size has been working well for me. And coming up close here, you can actually see some of the tiny melons starting to form. So those are the 4 I have on this deck. I'll show you the other 4 that I have because, like I said, they do take up a lot of room when they sprawl out, so I've actually moved them to different places, but I'll show you that near the end of the video. So like I said, any container type will really work as long as it has enough space, so look for something about 16 inches deep, 14 inches wide. I'm glad I chose the ones that I'm using. I like the grow bags because as the plants have gotten bigger, the grow bags themselves are light enough for me to move around. And then the raised beds or the elevated beds are nice too because that added height just gives them more space to trail over instead of just sprawling completely out all over the deck. So those are the containers that I'm using, a little bit of a closer look at the plants themselves. Next, I want to go over actually planting these plants. So when you're ready to actually put your plants in the container, you want to make sure you're filling your container with soil that's specifically made for containers, something that's going to have good drainage, a little bit of nutrients already in the soil. For me, I'm using just local soil that I get from garden centers around here, specifically made for pots. I fill the bag with that, put about 1 inch of compost and mix that together, and then I either start the seeds that I'm putting directly into the bags or the raised beds, or some of them I actually transplanted. So that moves me into kind of how you can start your plants. And I did a mix of both of these, so either direct sowing or starting them inside from seed. So I think I started them inside at about the beginning of March, and they looked okay by the time I was ready to plant, but some of them looked like they might be a little bit weak. So just to be safe, I also direct sowed melon plants as well. And I think that's why I probably ended up with so many. Also, it's really hard for me to actually thin the seeds, but you can start them both ways, and I've had success in my garden both ways. And interestingly enough, the ones that I've started from seed, direct sowed, and the ones I started inside are now about the same size anyway, so I don't notice a huge difference between the plants, even though I started them about 2 months apart. If you are going to direct sow your seeds, obviously wait until after your last frost date. Melons like it warm, and then sow 3 or 4 seeds per container and then thin it down to the strongest seedlings. I've actually seen people growing 2 melon plants within the same container. I've stuck to 1 just in all of mine because I had enough containers. I figured I would give them a little bit more space just to make sure that they were happy. And then if you are direct sowing them, you want to make sure you keep the soil consistently moist until they begin to sprout. So that brings me to my next point, which is to talk about how to water melon plants in containers. Now, melon plants are going to like soil that's consistently moist but not too soggy. So obviously, again, make sure you're using a container that has adequate drainage. On the flip side of that, though, when you are growing melons in containers, you do want to keep a closer eye on the moisture level because containers dry out faster than if you were growing your melons in the ground. Now, something like this raised bed, this one doesn't dry out quite as fast just because the size of the bed itself, so it retains moisture a little bit longer compared to, for example, the grow bags that I'm using. The grow bags are much smaller, they're a lot more porous, so they're going to dry out faster. If you want to have a little peace of mind, like I do, you can set up a drip system, which basically is going to water the plants on a consistent basis when they need it without me having to actually be outside in the garden monitoring the plants. Another great thing about the drip system is that it waters directly at the roots, which is what you want to do if you are hand watering. So make sure you're not just dumping the water on the leaves. That can be a breeding ground for disease. You want to make sure you're watering directly at the roots in the soil and avoiding getting any moisture on the leaves themselves. Now, something interesting about watering melons is that when the melons are getting just about ripe, you want to actually cut back on the amount that you're watering them. And the bag that I showed you that has the watermelons, which are already a pretty good size, I've actually pulled out the drip from that bag because they're, again, probably a few weeks away from being ready. You can really look for something about like tennis ball size, and then that's when you can start reducing the water. So instead of watering when, the top layer of soil is dry, I water it much less frequently, usually when the majority of the soil is almost dry, and that's just going to make sure that your fruit has a much higher sugar content and it's going to taste less watery. So that's something that's kind of different for melon plants compared to other plants that you're growing in your garden. So I know I mentioned trellising a little bit earlier, and I showed you kind of what I'm doing, but I would definitely say trellising is probably where I failed the most or failed to plan the most this year, because I kind of just planted them where I wanted and was like, I'll figure out trellising later, which actually seems to be the trend for me for any plants in general. But in a do as I say, not as I do moment, definitely plan your trellis system in advance and what you're going to do, because the vines really will just start to take off before you can get it under control sometimes. So again, like I mentioned, I have these two trellises that originally had sweet peas on them, or still do have some sweet peas. I haven't had much luck with them, but I've been able to just weave the vine through so that the vines are able to go up the wall instead of completely taking over the deck space here. I also actually have two smaller trellises, which you can't see because they're covered by the plants themselves, but that's what's giving this little extra hill here of the vines, so just giving them something else to climb up so that they have more space to trail down. I really like growing melons in the elevated bed that's this height, and I think I will probably do that again next year because they have all this space to hang down and I can keep them pretty nice and trim once they actually get to the deck themselves. You can also use tomato cages. I mean, basically anything that you could trellis any other plant up, you can trellis melons. Something that I haven't had to deal with yet, and I don't know if I do, is that once you have melons hanging on trellises, so mine are obviously sitting on the ground, they have support, but if you have melons that are hanging down and you don't have support for them, you're going to want to find some sort of way to create a sling that's going to provide that support for the melon, just so it doesn't break your plant. So I know that people have used things like nylons or netted produce bags, but really anything that you can create a sling out of, you'll want to do that for your melons. If I have a melon growing in that situation, which again I don't think I will since I don't have anything trailing up super high, but if I do have to do that in my garden, I'll make another video showing how to do that. The next tip is around fertilization, and because melons are heavy feeders, you're definitely going to want to fertilize your plants. When you're first planting them in the potting soil, again, usually potting soil is going to have some sort of nutrients in it. So after maybe about 4 to 5 weeks is when you're going to want to start fertilizing with a water-soluble fertilizer. When the plants are smaller, I tend to cut the recommended amount on whatever fertilizer I'm using in half. So make sure you follow the instructions on the packaging. It's going to be different for every type of fertilizer that you might use. And then after that is when I'll use kind of the full strength fertilizer for my plants. You're also going to want to switch between the fertilizers that you're using. So when the plants are starting to grow, you're going to want to use a more balanced fertilizer to get them to grow larger. But once they start setting their flowers, which is what's going to turn into the melon on the plant, you want to switch to a fertilizer that's specifically for blooms, and typically that's going to be something that has a lower nitrogen component of the fertilizer, which is the first number when you're looking at the 3 numbers on the fertilizer itself. So the brand that I use, I mentioned this before, is Fox Farm. It's just the brand I happened to find first when I started gardening, and I like it a lot. So I'll use their Grow Big and the initial stages, that's the name of the fertilizer, is Grow Big, and then I'll switch to the Tiger Bloom liquid fertilizer once I see flowers starting to grow on my melon plants. You also want to be on the lookout for pests on your melon plants, and yes, they do have pests. I've already been battling some of them already, but when you're in your garden, just do a regular checkup of the plants, looking underneath the leaves, seeing if there's anything that you need to deal with. Some of the more common ones that you might see are grasshoppers or leaf miner flies, beetles. I've seen some of those, but the one that I'm kind of most on the lookout for are the cucumber beetles. I think they're spotted and striped, or vine borers, because those have the potential to not just like eat the leaves, for example, like some pests like the grasshoppers, but those will bore into the vines and eventually kill your plant, which obviously you don't want to have happen. So keep an eye out for any pests. If you do see them, then make sure you remove them. If you do have something that's bored into the vine, you can actually try to cut open the vine and remove the pest, and then hopefully the plant will survive. But a lot of times, by the time you notice that there is something that's bored into your vine, the plant is already too far gone. So that's why it's important to keep a close eye. When I do see pests, I will use usually Captain Jack's Dead Brew just to get rid of the pest and monitor them, or I'll pick them off and kill them myself so that they don't come back in the garden, but I have been very protective of my melon plants because this is the first year I'm growing them. I'm really excited. I want to make sure I actually get to taste the fruit on my plants that I'm growing. This is the other deck that we have on our house that faces the east side, and you can see I've moved some of the melon plants over here just because since I'm letting them vine out, they were taking up so much room all clustered together. So I now have 2 watermelon, which the watermelon have taken off in comparison to the honeydew and the cantaloupe. But then I have a honeydew there and a cantaloupe there. So this is meant to be kind of our like seeding area deck, but it's now being taken over by melons, and I'll just take you in close and show you some of the ones that are growing because they're tiny and cute. So there's one melon, there's another one, I think there's, yep, a third one right in here. So I have 3 that have really started taking off over here of the watermelons, 2 up front. I've eaten one already, so that's 6 total, and I'm pretty happy with that harvest, even if that's all that we get for this year. So I think that's everything for today as far as how to grow melons in containers. Like I mentioned earlier, this is my first year and I've been really amazed at the success I've had. I didn't expect to have 9 plants all producing melons in my garden. I'll definitely cut down on the number next year, but I'm just excited that I have been so successful just right out of the gate. So hopefully by following these tips, it'll help you grow melons in your garden. I'll also leave in the comments or in the description below some varieties that are a bit smaller, so that might be more beneficial for you if you're just starting off with growing melons in your garden and don't have a ton of space. But other than that, thank you so much for watching. If you have any tips for anyone that wants to grow melons, leave them in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!